It started as a simple visit to the doctor. I'd been struggling with insomnia for the better part of 6 months, and it was wearing me down. Late nights turned into groggy mornings, and I was walking around in a fog for most of the day. My performance at work had dipped, and I found myself making simple mistakes that I normally wouldn't. Something had to give. My doctor, Dr. Patel, was patient with me as I described the symptoms. We had tried some basic over-the-counter options, and I'd even tried adjusting my routine, cutting back on caffeine, dimming the lights, turning off electronics, but nothing seemed to stick. He listened as I explained how, when I finally did manage to sleep, it was fitful and broken, like my brain couldn't quite let go of the day. "I think it's time we tried something a little stronger," he said, typing something into his computer. "I'm going to prescribe you a medication to help regulate your sleep cycle." It sounded like a reasonable next step. I was hesitant about taking prescription meds for sleep, but Dr. Patel assured me that it was a low dose and designed to help without any significant side effects. "This should help reset things for you," he explained as he handed me the prescription. "Take it about an hour before you plan on going to bed, and make sure you give yourself a full 8 hours of sleep. If it's not working, or if you feel off in any way, let me know." I left his office feeling hopeful for the first time in a while. That night I followed his instructions to the letter. I took the pill, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed with my usual doubts that it would work. To my surprise, the first few nights went smoothly. The medication helped me fall asleep quickly, and though I would wake up once or twice during the night, I fell back asleep almost instantly. It was the kind of restful sleep I hadn't had in months. But after about a week, things started to change. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things, at least things I tried to ignore. I'd wake up feeling a bit disoriented, not entirely sure how long I'd been asleep. Sometimes I'd have vague, unsettling dreams I couldn't quite remember, dreams where I wasn't sure if I was awake or still dreaming. In these dreams, I'd find myself doing normal things, walking through my apartment, getting a drink of water, or checking my phone, but something always felt slightly off, like I was observing myself from a distance, instead of really being there. At first, I brushed it off. I figured it was just my body adjusting to the new medication. After all, Dr. Patel had mentioned that it might take a little while to fully settle in. I went about my days as usual, and for the most part, I was just grateful to finally be getting some sleep. Then one night, I had an experience that left me feeling more than a little unsettled. I woke up around 3 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. The apartment was completely dark, and as I shuffled down the hallway, I felt like I wasn't alone. It's difficult to explain, but the sensation was strong enough that I found myself looking over my shoulder several times. My heart rate quickened, but I tried to reason with myself that it was just the grogginess from waking up in the middle of the night. I returned to bed and eventually fell back asleep, though I had a lingering feeling that something was off. The next morning, I laughed at myself for overreacting. After all, it was just a sensation. I'd lived in my apartment for 2 years without incident. There was no reason to think anything had changed. Besides, it was an old building, and I'd always heard the occasional creak or draft. It wasn't unusual. But that night, something similar happened again. I woke up suddenly, no specific reason why. The room was silent, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened somehow. I lay still for a few moments, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. My mind was racing, trying to identify what had pulled me out of sleep so abruptly. And then I saw it, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there, just my room, the same as always. It had to be a trick of the mind. My rational brain knew that. I had just woken up, I was half asleep, and the darkness was playing tricks on me. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Every time, it was the same, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, and then nothing. At this point, I started wondering if it was the medication. Maybe it was messing with my perception, causing me to see things that weren't really there. I decided to skip a dose, just to see if that made any difference. That night, I struggled to fall asleep without the pill. It was almost as if my body had become reliant on it. I tossed and turned for hours, and when I finally did drift off, it wasn't restful sleep. When I woke up, I felt worse than before, and I hadn't escaped the strange sensations either. Even without the medication, I saw that same fleeting movement in the corner of my vision. It was starting to get to me. I couldn't bring myself to call Dr. Patel yet. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. Or maybe I thought I could figure it out on my own. Either way, I kept taking the pills, hoping things would smooth out again. But they didn't. Instead, they escalated. The fleeting glimpses out of the corner of my eye became more frequent, and I started hearing faint sounds in the apartment at night. It wasn't anything specific, just subtle noises like the soft creak of a floorboard or the quiet rustle of fabric. Things that could easily be explained away if I tried hard enough. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had initially dismissed it, but it's now gnawing at me. It was that strange kind of paranoia where you know something's wrong, but you keep trying to convince yourself it's nothing. I kept thinking, it's just the medication. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore what I was experiencing. The visions, those flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, became more distinct. Before, I could tell myself they were just shadows, tricks of the mind. But now, I could swear I was seeing shapes, like figures standing just out of sight. I never got a clear look, and every time I turned my head to focus, they were gone. But that didn't make them feel any less real. In fact, it made them worse. I started turning on lights whenever I woke up in the middle of the night. The logic was simple. If I could see my surroundings clearly, I wouldn't feel so unsettled. But even with the lights on, the sensation didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. The figures might have disappeared when I switched on the lights, but the feeling of not being alone remained. It was almost as if the light itself couldn't reach every corner of the room. After a particularly rough night, I made up my mind to call Dr. Patel. I needed to know if the medication could be causing these side effects, sleep disturbances, paranoia, hallucinations, anything to explain what was happening. I was anxious, but maybe I was also hoping he would reassure me that this was normal, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. When I finally got through to him, I laid it all out. The dreams, the sensations, the glimpses of movement. I tried to sound as rational as possible, though I wasn't sure how much of that came through in my voice. To his credit, Dr. Patel didn't dismiss my concerns outright. He asked about the specific brand of medication I was taking, double-checked the dosage, and even went over the side effects again, but none of what I described sounded typical to him. He suggested that I stop taking the pills immediately to see if the symptoms went away, and scheduled a follow-up appointment for later that week. I hung up feeling somewhat relieved, but a part of me was skeptical. What if it wasn't the medication? What if something else was happening? Still, I followed his advice. That night I didn't take the pill. It didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. Without the medication, I was back to struggling with insomnia. I spent hours tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep, but never quite managing it. And yet, even in the dark, even without the disorienting haze of sleep pulling me under, I kept seeing them. The shadows. They weren't just fleeting glimpses now. It felt like they were there, in the room with me, watching. I'd sit up in bed and stare at the doorway or the far corner of the room, where I swore I could see something, a figure standing silently, barely perceptible. I would blink, and it would disappear, but the tension it left behind was unbearable. One night, after lying awake for what felt like hours, I got up and started pacing the apartment. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like I couldn't stay still any longer. The silence was oppressive. I needed to move, to do something to shake the feeling that was creeping over me. I walked to the kitchen, half thinking that a glass of water would help calm me down. As I reached for a glass in the cupboard, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. It startled me for a moment, seeing movement when I wasn't expecting it. But what really unnerved me was that, in the reflection, it looked like someone else was standing behind me. I spun around so quickly I nearly knocked the glass out of my hand, but the kitchen was empty. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was a trick of the dim lighting, but my nerves were shot. I didn't bother with the water. I went back to my room, turned on every light I could, and sat on my bed, trying to breathe slowly, trying to calm down. The next morning I was exhausted. It felt like I hadn't slept at all, and my brain was foggy from the lack of rest. But the worst part was that the sensations weren't confined to the night anymore. During the day, I began noticing things too. Not visions exactly, but more like the overwhelming sense that someone was standing just behind me, watching. It happened in my apartment, at work, even when I was walking down the street. I found myself turning around constantly, expecting to catch someone or something there, only to be met with empty air. I must have looked ridiculous, jumping at nothing, but it wasn't something I could control. My rational mind knew that there was no one there, but it didn't stop the feeling. It was primal, like something deep inside me was screaming that I wasn't safe. I couldn't keep ignoring it. The medication was out of my system now, but the visions and sensations weren't. It had to be something else. I started researching, spending hours on forums and reading articles about sleep disorders, hallucinations, and sleep paralysis, but none of it quite fit. People described similar experiences, visions in the dark, the feeling of being watched, but it didn't explain why this was happening to me now, why I felt this constant presence, even during the day, even when I was wide awake. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I wasn't hallucinating. This wasn't just in my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been living in my apartment for over 2 years, and during that time, I hadn't really given much thought to my neighbors. I saw them occasionally in the hallway, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but we weren't close. Still, something about my next-door neighbor had always struck me as odd. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a feeling I got every time I saw him, a kind of unease. He was quiet, always polite, but I'd noticed that he had strange habits. He rarely left his apartment, and when he did, it was always at odd hours, like in the middle of the night. I'd hear him walking down the hallway, his footsteps barely audible, but distinct in the silence of the building. It never bothered me before, but now I found myself wondering if there was more to it. Could it be connected? Could he be watching me somehow? The thought seemed absurd at first, but I couldn't shake it. I had no real evidence, no reason to think my neighbor had anything to do with the strange occurrences in my apartment. But the idea burrowed itself into my mind, and once it was there, I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention, watching him whenever I could, and that's when I realized that something had changed. I couldn't explain how, but I knew it. My neighbor was watching me too. The idea that my neighbor might be involved in what was happening felt ridiculous at first. I mean, what could he possibly have to do with my insomnia, the medication, or the strange sensations I was feeling? But once the thought was there, I couldn't shake it. It wasn't just that he was quiet and kept to himself. Plenty of people are like that. It was something more. There were little things that, on their own, might have seemed like nothing, but together started forming a pattern, like how I'd started hearing faint sounds through the wall late at night. It wasn't loud, just a sort of muffled shuffling, like someone moving around quietly, deliberately. At first I thought maybe he was just up late, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing over there at 2 or 3 in the morning, especially when I'd catch glimpses of him leaving his apartment at those same hours. It didn't take long for me to start paying more attention to him. I started lingering in the hallway longer when I knew he was coming or going, or keeping an eye on the peephole when I heard him moving outside my door. He never did anything overtly suspicious, no strange packages or anything like that, but there was an intensity in the way he carried himself. His movements were always purposeful, like he was focused on something I couldn't quite figure out. And then there were the stairs. I didn't notice it right away, but eventually I realized that every time we crossed paths, he would hold my gaze just a little too long. Not in a friendly or even a curious way. It was more like he was trying to figure me out. It unsettled me, but I kept telling myself that I was reading too much into it. After all, I'd been feeling paranoid and on edge for days now. It made sense that I might start looking for a cause, even if there wasn't one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, that he knew more than he was letting on. A few nights later, things took a turn. I was lying in bed, once again struggling to fall asleep, when I heard it, the faint sound of something tapping against the wall. I sat up in bed, listening closely. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely there. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at the wall, my mind racing. Was it him? Was he trying to get my attention? I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping continued for another minute or so, and then it stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something else to happen, but the apartment was silent. I told myself it could have been anything, the pipes, the heating system, even a mouse in the wall, but none of those explanations felt right. It sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the tapping in my mind, like an echo that wouldn't go away. The next day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was going on. It wasn't just the insomnia or the strange visions. It was everything. The feeling of being watched, the noises, The way my neighbor always seemed to be lurking just out of sight, it was too much. I started by doing a little research. I looked up the building's history, just to see if there was anything strange about it. But there wasn't. It was a standard apartment building built in the 1970s, with no reported issues or incidents. The previous tenants seemed normal enough too, just regular people who had come and gone over the years. There was nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here. But that didn't stop me from feeling like something was wrong. I knew it sounded paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my neighbor was involved somehow. So I started watching him more closely. I'd stand near my window and peek through the blinds when I knew he was leaving his apartment. I noticed that he always left at odd times, usually late at night or early in the morning, but he never stayed out long. It was like he was doing something in secret, something he didn't want anyone else to know about. Then one night I saw something that made my blood run cold. I had been watching him leave again, like I had done so many times before, when I noticed something strange. As he walked down the hall, he glanced over his shoulder, directly at my door. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about the way he looked that made my skin crawl. It was like he knew I was watching him, even though I was behind the blinds. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting to see what he would do. And then, just as quickly as he had looked, he turned and continued down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Did he know? Had he known all along that I was watching him? And if so, why hadn't he said anything? Why hadn't he confronted me? The next day, I decided to take things a step further. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly on edge, wondering if I was being watched. I needed answers, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I knocked on his door. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. I was walking down the hall, trying to gather the courage to confront him, when I found myself standing in front of his apartment. Before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked 3 times and waited. At first, there was no response. I started to turn away, embarrassed, thinking maybe he wasn't home, when the door creaked open. He stood there, staring at me, his expression unreadable. Up close, I could see that he was older than I had initially thought, with deep-set eyes and greying hair that contrasted sharply with his dark clothing. "Yes," he said, his voice low and calm, like nothing was out of the ordinary. For a moment I didn't know what to say. All the rehearsed lines I had prepared vanished from my mind. Finally I managed to speak. I live next door," I began, stumbling over my words. "I just wanted to introduce myself." He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. We exchanged a few more pleasantries, names, how long we'd lived in the building, the usual small talk. But as we spoke, I kept getting the same feeling I always had around him, that there was something off. His responses were polite but clipped, like he was hiding something. He didn't ask me any questions in return, didn't seem curious about why I was standing at his door. It felt like he wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Finally, after what felt like an endless wait, I excused myself and returned to my apartment. I didn't learn anything new from that conversation, but the feeling that something was wrong hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. Something was definitely happening, and I was determined to find out what. The brief exchange with my neighbor left me feeling more unsettled than before. As much as I had tried to approach him casually, it felt forced, artificial. It was as if we were both playing a part, pretending to be two normal people having an ordinary conversation, when something darker lay just beneath the surface. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but my gut told me I was onto something. I just didn't know what. I spent the next few days trying to go about my life as usual, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building in the apartment. The noises at night didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. Every night, I would hear that faint tapping through the wall, like someone knocking gently, rhythmically, as if to say, "I'm still here." During the day, I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, feeling like someone was watching me, even when I was alone. It had gotten so bad that I started leaving the lights on all the time, day and night, just to try and dispel the uneasy feeling, but the light didn't help anymore. The shadows felt like they were always there, lurking just out of reach, waiting. I wasn't sleeping well either. The medication was out of my system, but I was back to where I started, wide awake for hours at night, my mind racing, unable to relax. But now, on top of the insomnia, I had this gnawing sense of dread that wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it, the presence, like someone was standing right there beside my bed, just beyond my vision. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that if I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed to take a more direct approach. Watching my neighbor through the blinds and listening to strange sounds at night wasn't going to give me the answers I needed. I had to dig deeper, and that's when I came up with an idea, one that made me nervous just thinking about it. I was going to break into his apartment. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I knew it was illegal, and if I got caught, I'd be in serious trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever I was experiencing, it had something to do with him. The way he moved around at odd hours, the way he seemed to know more than he let on, the tapping through the wall, it all pointed to him. I needed proof, and I was determined to find it. I spent the next few days preparing. I kept an eye on his schedule, making note of when he left and when he returned. It wasn't hard to figure out. He kept to a pretty consistent routine. Most nights he would leave his apartment around midnight and wouldn't return until close to 3 a.m. That gave me a window of a few hours to get in and out without being caught. When the night finally came, I was a bundle of nerves. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I waited until I heard his door close and his footsteps fade down the hall before I moved. I had already scoped out the lock on his door. It was old, and I was confident I could get it open with a credit card. I wasn't exactly a locksmith, but I had watched a few videos online, and this didn't seem too complicated. I crept out into the hallway, every sound magnified in the silence of the building. My hands were shaking as I slid the card between the door and the frame, jiggling it slightly until I heard a soft click. The door creaked open, and I froze, listening for any sign that someone had heard me, but the hallway remained silent. I stepped inside. His apartment was almost identical to mine in layout, but it felt completely different. The air was heavier somehow, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The lights were off, but the street lamp outside cast just enough light through the windows for me to see. The furniture was sparse, barely anything beyond a couch, a table and a few chairs. There were no decorations, no photos, no personal touches. It felt cold, impersonal, like no one really lived there. I made my way carefully through the apartment, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured if there was something strange going on, I would know it when I saw it. I started in the living room, checking the drawers and cabinets, but there was nothing unusual, just the normal clutter you'd expect to find in someone's apartment. Then I moved to the bedroom. The door was slightly open, and as I pushed it wider, my stomach churned. The room was darker than the rest of the apartment, and I had to strain my eyes to see anything clearly. There was a bed against the far wall, neatly made, but nothing else in the room stood out. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd, a small door on the opposite side of the room, half hidden behind a tall bookshelf. It was a closet door, but it looked different from the ones in my apartment. For one thing, it had a padlock on it. That's when I knew I had found what I was looking for. I crouched down, examining the lock. It wasn't anything special, just a cheap combination lock you could buy at any hardware store. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. There were scratches around the lock, like someone had tried to force it open before. I didn't have the tools to break the lock, but I wasn't about to give up. I tried a few random combinations, but the lock didn't budge. Frustrated, I stood up and backed away from the door, trying to think. Maybe there was something else in the apartment that could give me a clue, something that would help me figure out what was inside. I turned back to the bedroom and started searching more thoroughly. I pulled open drawers, looked under the bed, even checked the pockets of jackets hanging in the closet. And that's when I found it, a small notebook tucked away in the bottom drawer of the nightstand. I flipped it open and what I saw made my skin crawl. The notebook was filled with pages and pages of writing, but it wasn't ordinary writing. It was like someone had been keeping a detailed log of me. There were notes about my schedule, my habits, even my conversations. Entries like left for work at 8:10 a.m., returned home at 6:45 p.m., went to bed at 11 o'clock p.m. It was all there, down to the smallest detail. But the most unsettling part was the recent entries. They were about my insomnia, about me waking up in the middle of the night, and about me seeing shadows. Whoever had written this knew exactly what I was experiencing. It was like they were watching me, waiting for me to break. I snapped the notebook shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to think. Had my neighbor been spying on me this whole time? And if so, why? What was the point? I stuffed the notebook in my pocket and hurried out of the apartment, my mind racing with questions. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I needed to get out of there. I needed to figure out what was going on. As I locked his door behind me and stepped back into my apartment, I realized something chilling. The tapping on the wall, it had never been a random noise. It had been him all along. I barely slept after that night. My thoughts were a storm of confusion and fear. The notebook, the strange sensations, the tapping on the wall, it was all too much to process. And yet, the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would my neighbor be keeping notes on me? How had he known so much about my insomnia and the shadows I was seeing? The whole thing felt like a bad dream, one I couldn't wake up from. The next morning I knew I had to go back to Dr. Patel. Something was wrong, not just with my neighbor, but with me. It felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The lack of sleep, the paranoia, the hallucinations, because that's what they were, weren't they? Hallucinations. It was the only explanation that made any sense. When I arrived at Dr. Patel's office, I was a mess. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands were trembling, and I could barely string a sentence together. He took one look at me and led me into his office without asking any questions. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaky. "I think there's something seriously wrong with me." Dr. Patel listened as I recounted everything, how the insomnia had turned into something worse, how I'd started seeing things and feeling like I was being watched. I told him about the tapping, the shadows, the notebook, and even my neighbor. The words spilled out of me in a rush, like I had been holding them back for too long. He frowned as I talked, and by the time I finished, he looked genuinely concerned. "This isn't normal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think the medication might be making it worse." Dr. Patel sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "I'm glad you came to me," he said, his voice calm but serious, "because I think we need to address something that I missed before." I felt a jolt of fear. "What do you mean?" He clicked a few keys on his computer and scanned the screen for a moment before turning back to me. "It seems there's been a mistake with your prescription." I blinked, not quite understanding what he was saying. "A mistake?" "The pharmacy gave you the wrong medication," he explained. "Instead of the sleep aid I prescribed, they accidentally gave you something used to treat schizophrenia and other severe mental health conditions. It's a powerful antipsychotic, and in someone without those conditions, it can cause serious side effects, including hallucinations, paranoia, and disorganized thinking." For a moment, I didn't speak. I just stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. The wrong medication, antipsychotics, it didn't seem real. "So, you're saying that everything I've been experiencing—" I trailed off, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's very likely that the medication caused your symptoms," he said gently. "The insomnia, the paranoia, the visions, they could all be explained by the side effects of the wrong drug. Your body's reaction to it, combined with the stress of not sleeping, created a perfect storm." I felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly followed by a deep, unsettling dread. If the medication was to blame, then none of it had been real. The shadows, the tapping, my neighbor's strange behavior, it was all in my head. My mind had been playing tricks on me, twisting reality into something nightmarish. But then something didn't sit right. "The notebook," I said, my voice shaky. "What about the notebook? It had all these details about my life, my schedule. How could that have been a hallucination?" Dr. Patel looked at me with sympathy. "The mind can create convincing scenarios when it's under duress, especially with the influence of the wrong medication. It's possible that you found an ordinary notebook and your mind filled in the blanks." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to accept that this was all just a terrible mistake, a side effect of the wrong medication, but something deep inside me couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I left his office with a new prescription, this time for the correct medication, and a plan to slowly wean off the antipsychotics. He assured me that once the wrong drug was out of my system, the hallucinations and paranoia would stop. But as I walked home, the relief I should have felt never fully arrived. Instead, I kept replaying everything that had happened, over and over in my mind. The tapping, the feeling of being watched, the unsettling moments where I had seen figures out of the corner of my eye. Had it all been in my head, or was there something more? When I reached my apartment, I stood in front of my neighbor's door for a long time. Everything felt different now. If the medication had been messing with my mind, then maybe he wasn't watching me after all. Maybe I had imagined it all. But as I turned to go into my apartment, something stopped me cold. The tapping. It was faint, but it was there, coming from the wall between our apartments. Tap, tap, tap. The same sound I had heard so many nights before. I stood frozen in place, my heart racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the medication was still affecting me, but the sound continued, steady and deliberate. I couldn't help myself. I moved toward the wall and pressed my ear against it, listening. Tap, tap, tap. And then, just as I was about to pull away, I heard something else. A voice. Low, almost a whisper, coming from the other side of the wall. "I've been watching you." I stopped breathing for a second, stumbling back as my pulse raced in my ears. The tapping stopped, and the apartment fell into silence. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Dr. Patel had said it was all in my head. The medication, the paranoia, the hallucinations, it was all a mistake. But as I looked at the wall, the silence pressing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. Or was it? I came out here to get away. I came out to this boat to get away from everything, and now it just won't let me. I know this is confusing, and I know I already sound crazy, but I just need to talk to someone. Anyone about what's going on, and I don't even remember why I came out here, so while I explain my situation to you, I'll try to put the pieces together myself. Let me start from the beginning. Last thing I remember before the lake was getting a text from my friend Rob, or Bill, or something with a B. He reached out and told me about some boat he was trying to flip. He got from an estate sale. A real beauty, he said. I remember him having an accent. In the process of him selling it, he needed someone to go out to stay on it until it was sold and fix anything that was wrong with it. I don't remember if I asked why he couldn't do it himself, but either way, I told him I would go out there for him. A few days after that, I took the 5-hour drive through the endless desert out of town to get to the lake the boat was left on. When I pulled into the marina's parking lot, there were only 2 or 3 other cars there. They were old and didn't look like they had been touched in months. I grabbed my bag and walked onto the dock as I felt the scorching heat beat down on me. As I approached the marina, I walked under the cracked paint of a rickety sign made from the kind of old wood you find in the desert that looked so worn and so warped you could feel the splinters just by looking at it. The sign said, "Welcome to Waitley Marina." Walking down the dock, I passed pier after pier after pier, finally reaching Pier 5. While this marina was nowhere near full, the boat I was going to stay on was as far from the entrance as possible and had no other boats docked around it. I stepped onto the front deck and picked up the key from under the doormat, which appropriately said, "Welcome aboard." I unlocked the sliding door and stepped inside. I looked around and was pretty impressed with the size of the boat. It was split into 2 sections, an upper deck and a lower deck. The upper deck had a small kitchen that wasn't too bad, ignoring the rotting food in the fridge, the filthy pots and pans in the sink, and the trash can overflowing with beer cans, the steering wheel, which no surprise didn't even budge, and a couch that looked to have been used as a bed and was unfortunately going to be my bed. The lower deck was a lot more eerie. It was a hoarder's wet dream. Crates and boxes everywhere, but strangely out of place was a table covered with newspapers and not books, almost like some kind of research station. I ignored the junk and immediately went to check if this thing had air conditioning. I was starting to feel noxious from the heat. Fortunately, with one flick of a switch, I heard the air come on. Once I was settled, I called my friend to tell him I made it out, but there was no answer, so I left a message. "Hey man, I made it out. Keep me updated with what the word is on selling this thing ahead of time so I can find somewhere else to stay. Talk to you later, bye." That night I was fixing the sink since it wouldn't drain while I was trying to clean. The feast's worth of dishes whoever was here left, but then I heard a knock at the door. I stood up and slowly approached the window and looked through the blinds. Some tall, lengthy guy was looking around the front deck for something. I slid the door open and asked, "Can I help you?" He stopped what he was doing like someone who just got caught committing a crime. No, sorry, I work for the marina. I was just curious to see who the new captain was." His attempt to joke was not amusing. "Well, you met him, so," I said, as I gestured for him to get off the boat. As I turned to go back inside, he stopped me. "You don't know who he was, do you?" "What?" I responded. He almost looked like he was trying to hide his excitement as he walked towards the edge of the deck. The last guy who lived here, real creep. No one really got to talk to him much, but from the things I heard. He paused and turned back towards me. I wouldn't want this thing. I would be lying if I said that didn't get to me a little, but I responded, "Get the fuck off my boat." He stepped off the deck onto the dock and walked into the blackness that surrounded the boat. I walked back inside and felt incredibly uneasy, as all of a sudden I felt like something was watching me, but not some passing feeling like the one you get when you wake up from a nightmare, or the one you get when you're home alone and the cloths in your closet are shaped a little too much like a shadowy figure staring at you, but more like there was something right behind me, breathing down my neck. The next day, I slept well into the afternoon and woke up convulsing and covered in sweat. It felt like I had something scratching its way out of my stomach, and I fell off the old scratchy sofa onto the hardwood floor and crawled over to the trash, where I vomited up this blackish sludge with the consistency of cottage cheese. It had these little golden flakes sprinkled through it. I was taken back by the sight of it at the time. I didn't think much of it either because of me just waking up a few seconds prior, or if I even really saw it, I don't know. Like I said before, I can't even trust myself anymore. After an hour or so, I was able to wake myself up a little more. Sadly, where I was lucky with the air conditioning working, I was not so fortunate in the shower having running water. I decided to call my friend again and again, no answer. "Hey man, it's me again, just waiting to hear back from you. I texted you a few times and you never answered, so I just wanted to see if there was any updates with selling the boat, but anyway, call me back." I left the message while I paced around the lower deck. After hanging up, I put the phone down on the table of what looked like the research station of whoever was here before me. The table was decorated with old torn newspapers, notebooks splayed out with missing pages, crates and chests made from peeling wood and rusty nails, and above the table was a fishing map of the lake the boat sat on, scribbled with markers, and a crudely drawn legend. Looking down at the table, a greenish leather-bound book stood out to me. It had the texture of tight, stitched skin, and its shade of green did not look like it was dyed, but more of a sickly color. Against my better judgment, I lifted the book and began to flip through the pages, but before I got a good look at any of the what seemed to be crudely drawn images, a folded paper fell from between the pages. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a zoomed-in part of the map, and it looked to have the similar scribbles as the larger maps on the wall. I had nothing better to do on the boat, so since the map showed somewhere relatively close to the dock entrance, I decided to go investigate. After reaching the spot where the map was leading to, I was disappointed to find nothing. I was surrounded by sand and beached tires that were at some point used as buoys, but there was something that stood out to me, a large generator on a platform that was sinking into the sand. I walked over to it, and I saw something under its platform, a small chest similar to the ones back on the boat. The chest was much newer than the things on the boat, but in not much better condition. It had been wrapped in rope holding creepy-looking red crucifix to it, and the rope had been tied in a way of preventing it from being opened even if you could get the lock off. I had never been a superstitious person before then, so I wrote it off and carried it back to the boat, despite its fishy smell. By the time I got back to the boat, the sun was starting to go down. I stepped into the boat and put the chest onto the table at the center of the upper deck. Looking around, I found a knife to cut the ropes off the chest, causing the crucifix to fall onto the table, where I noticed they weren't red, it was blood. Or at least it was supposed to be. From the little Jesus's head to his knees, he was covered in blood, and his face looked like he was screaming, not the usual sad look on most crucifix. Even though the lock wouldn't budge after a sturdy pull, the hinges it was attached to came loose enough to pop off with my hands. Before opening it, I saw crosses carved into the box. This finally stopped me for a second. I looked around and wondered if this was safe. Sure, I wasn't religious and I didn't believe in all the superstitions, but maybe I should take the warning. All of a sudden, in a blink, I was holding something. The chest was open and I was holding a statue or idol. I don't know what you would call it, but it's hard to describe what it was. It looked like a lengthy, thin man sitting on a cube curled into himself, but his feet were the talons of a hawk and leather dragon wings were folded behind him as they hung down the back of the cube. But the face looked mostly human. Its eyes were closed and it was missing ears, but its nose was that of a bat, and its mouth looked like a splayed open flower that's opening reached all the way down the creature's throat. I was mesmerized by it, but I was quickly snapped out of it as I felt a distinct 3 knock in the ground below me. I moved the table and dragged the rug under it away from the center of the room, and now in its place was a trap. door with what looked like small golden flakes in large burn marks around its edges where it met the rest of the floor. I knelt down to the door. I didn't even notice it was almost pitch black as there was no more sun to shine in through the windows. I slowly lifted it open and a bright red beam shined from inside the trap door. It was beautiful. Barbed wire shot from the light's origin and wrapped around me, cutting into my skin as it tightened around my wrist and my neck. I felt blood start to drip from my hands and run down under my shirt as they tightened. Then once again I woke up. I woke up the next day on the floor of the upper deck, once again covered in sweat and coughing. I heard a knock at the door. I thought it was that dock worker snooping around again. I told him to stay off my boat after he tried to scare me. He insulted me. He threatened me. He was here to hurt me. I thought about this as I stood up and stomped towards the door, and I quickly forgot it as I forcefully slid open the door to see her standing there with her dark curly hair, and in a nervous voice she said, "Hey, you!" It was Sarah. Sarah is my girlfriend. I think we broke up. Quickly I straightened myself out and stepped to the side as I invited her in. "How have you been, Lou?" I was dazed and couldn't focus on what she was saying. I only then remembered what happened the night before. "Lou." "Yeah, sorry." I came to again. "How are you?" I tried to smile. "Are you okay? It's been weeks since I've seen you. You kind of just stormed out after we fought." She was visibly uncomfortable. "It wasn't like you." I started to remember more from before I came to the boat. "Wait, weeks? I've only been out here for a couple days." I cut off my thought as I looked past her. I saw him. That fucking dock worker was standing on the deck. He was smiling and waving through the window. That piece of shit was taunting me, and I sprinted out the door, throwing it open. But as its frame slid across my vision, he was gone. I stepped out onto the deck and looked around like a mad dog, panting, almost growling. Sarah followed after and asked, "Lou, what's going on?" That's the last thing I remember hearing. I know she kept trying to get my attention, but I couldn't hear her. She tried to grab my hand, but I snapped and screamed at her, "Don't fucking touch me!" She stumbled back and looked at me in fear as tears started running down her face. She turned around and walked down the dock as the sun set. I went back inside and looked down at the exposed trap door. I ignored it and went into the bathroom as I looked into the mirror and saw the scars from the wire across my neck and up my forearms. I walked into the lower deck and saw the green book. This time I flipped through it, more focused on seeing something. What I thought were scribbled drawings were clearly now some kind of ritualistic depictions of sacrifice, some blood eagle type shit. As I looked through the book, I heard singing from behind me on the wall on either side of the bathroom door, where two singing fish both started singing Bad Moon Rising, but quickly stopped. Then after a few seconds they turned back to me and said in unison, "Gift from God." They started chanting, "Gift from God, gift from God, gift from God." I ran to the upper deck and saw a shotgun leaning against the wall. I grabbed it and pointed it towards the lower deck, but out of nowhere this giant hulk of a figure stood in front of me, and a quick motion took the gun out of my hands and kicked me to the floor. I looked back up and both the figure and the gun were gone. The boat started to shake as I began to hear banging on the roof, like I was at the center of a hailstorm, as I curled into a ball, praying for the first time in my life for this to stop. And then it stopped and it was quiet. I cautiously stepped outside onto the dock. From the small spotlight from the deck of the boat, I can see the deck and the roof of the boat are both covered in fish still flopping. I look down the dock into the darkness, and the shadows creep closer as I feel my feet become cold and wet. I am sinking into something, some dark red sea of death, and I begin hands pulling me down deeper. I was beginning to drown, but I felt a flat surface. I begin to kick and push on it, and when it finally gives in, I climb out of the trap door and crawl across the floor, soaking wet. At that point I realized I would never leave this boat. I slept on the floor that night as I cried myself to sleep. Over the course of the next day I woke up in the study. I woke up to knocking again, this time more assertive than aggressive. The sun burned my eyes, and I was barely able to get to the door without closing all the blinds first. When I finally slid the door open, shielding my eyes as they adjusted, I saw someone about my height wearing a blue shirt as he stood behind a taller, broader shape wearing a large hat and the glint of a badge on its waist. "Mr. Williams," the taller one said. "I'm Adam Green. I'm with the county. May we come in? I have a few questions about Sarah Adelaide." I let the two in. The man in the blue walked past me, barely acknowledging me, as he was animeered by the upper deck of the boat, and as I went to sit down, the deputy or sheriff or whatever stood in front of me and opened a small notebook. "I would offer you something to eat, but I don't really have much to eat," I said. The tall John Wayne type ignored my offering and asked, "When was the last time you saw Miss Adelaide?" "Yesterday, I think." "Why, is everything okay?" I ask, as I feel a sudden pounding in my head as I put my face in my hands. "We don't know anything yet, sir." He ignores my question. "She was reported missing by her roommate a little over a month ago." I felt a chill. Last anyone heard was that she was coming out here looking for you. I looked up from my palms and asked, "I'm sorry, did you say a month?" He took no time to respond. "Yes, sir. It's been a couple days since we got the call, but the owners of the marina called about an abandoned car. Long story short, we're here now. When was the last time you heard from Miss Adelaide?" I struggled to think. I thought yesterday, but I guess I'm a little confused. "It seems so. What was your relationship with Miss Adelaide?" He was rude and inconsiderate. "She is or was my girlfriend." "Wait, why did you say was? Do you think something happened to her?" He scribbled something down. "He thinks I did something to her." "No, sir. Your neighbors mentioned overhearing an argument. One would assume a disagreement your neighbors could hear would end any relationship the two of you might have had." "What the fuck does that mean?" "Yeah, we had a fight. I guess I lost my temper." "Did your fight have anything to do with you purchasing the boat?" he asked. "No, I'm just watching it for a friend." He finally looked up from his notes and looked at the man in blue. "That's not what I have here, Mr. Williams." "What do you mean?" "Mr. Williams, this boat is under your name. This boat is yours." My heart sank. I looked between the two of them. "You seem pretty confused, Mr. Williams. Give me a call if you think of anything." He gave me a paper, and then two of them walked out past me, but the man in blue stopped. "It's pretty crazy finally seeing the inside of this place. Normally we're not allowed on the residence boats. The last guy who lived here was a creep." I responded, "I'll keep that in mind next time I see the other guy. I'll keep that in mind." "Other guy? Which other guy?" I attempted to joke. "The other dock worker, the one without the baby blue uniform." The dock worker stared for a second. "Right. Have a nice day, Mr. Williams." I didn't move for the rest of the day. Not to lock the door after they left. Not for hours until I heard knocking coming from the lower deck. I stood up and stormed down the stairs looking for something in the research area, anything to tell me what the hell is wrong with this boat. And then I looked up and locked eyes with that goddamn statue. I grabbed it and marched towards the exit, and as I stood at the edge of the dock and looked down into the palm of my hand where the visage of that mutation, and without second thought, I threw it out into the darkness of the lake. It disappeared into the shadow, but it made no splash. I stood there for a second waiting as I felt stillness, like the whole world stopped spinning, like the lake I stood on was now waveless. I took a deep breath and tried to take in the last bit of peace I would ever experience as the stillness was interrupted by the thunder of sprinting footsteps on the dock quickly approaching me. At the last second I turn, and I am tackled onto my splintered dock as a familiar tall lengthy man crouches above me. As he bashes the same idol I tried to drown into my face while I feel the bones in my face crack on the shaped stone. Eventually I fell limp and only felt my collar being pulled as I was dragged across the dock back onto my boat. My eyes were swollen shut and I was choking on my own blood, but I could hear him throw open the trap door. He said, "Look at it, it's beautiful. It's perfect. Our Lord of Flies shines his light for you, and you are ungrateful." I gained enough strength to reach into my pocket and find my keys. I put each of them in between my fingers and stood to my feet as I threw myself towards where I hoped he would be, and luckily I felt the keys stab into his side between his ribs. He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me onto the floor as my head hung off the edge of the floor into the trap door. I was able to break his grip and head-butt him as I felt a tooth sticking out of my forehead. I climbed on top of him and began punching, but as my vision slowly came back, the punches I threw became more violent. My vision was then clear, and I saw him covering his face. I pulled his hands back and began to bash my head into his face over and over and over and over. I finally pulled back my head after God knows how long, and as his blood ran from the tooth dent end in my forehead, past my broken nose into my mouth, and touched my tongue, I felt my jaw begin to break and reshape as my teeth grew into jagged fangs, and once again I plunged my head into his neck as I tasted his blood and began to drain the life from his body. Where he saw himself as a prophet of some primordial deity living in this lake, he was really a sacrifice to the birth of me, a new god. The next morning I woke up with my nails stabbed into the ceiling as I hung perched facing the door, finally being greeted by once again a knock. I crawled across the ceiling, dropped onto the upper deck, and opened the door to see Adam Green. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. May I come in?" I stepped out of the way, welcoming him in. As he stepped in, he started with, "I thought I would come back to see if I could ask you a few more questions. You seemed pretty out of it yesterday, sir." I guess I was. I didn't care about what questions he had. I just wanted to wait for a chance to bite. "This is a nice boat, sir. You know my dad had one just like it. I've been meaning to do something with it for a while now." "Is that right?" I was getting eager. I started drooling as all things in my vision that wasn't him began to blur. I was so focused it was like I could see the blood pumping through his veins. "Yeah, the family spent a whole year living out here." He hung his head as he reminisced. Once again I felt my jaw crack and my teeth grow. I opened my mouth as I prepared myself to bite, until he asked his first question. "Have you checked the trapdoor?" I felt a chill. "The trapdoor?" "Yeah, we had one on ours. The whole reason we spent so long out here was because our house burnt down at the beginning of the summer, so in a way of saying the breaks not ruined. My parents took us out to live on the lake for a couple months, but a couple months turned into a through the winter." I gave a suspicious look as I noticed his hand holding the gun on his hip. But once it started heating up one day, we woke up to scratching from under the floor and a rancid smell. It didn't take long for my dad to check the cargo, and the second he opened it, it was like looking into a nightmare. A family of rats must have gotten stuck in there over the winter, but there was one left eating the rest of them, the size of a small cat, clawing and screaming on top of a pile of fleshy bodies. We spent the next 2 days filling trash bags of rat bodies and throwing them overboard. "Why are you telling me this? What's your point?" He unclipped his gun, keeping it in its holster. "Because, Lou, the second you opened the door today, I smelled the same thing I did all those years ago. Call it morbid curiosity, but I'm pretty sure you got something bigger than some inbred rat down there." Then in a stern voice he said, "Open it." I stood for a second looking down at his gun, then back up to him before pulling away the old rug and kneeling before the cursed splintered wood of the trap door. I looked up at him and said, "Witness." I stayed staring at him as he quickly pulled his gun, and a horrified expression came across his face. "What the fuck?" I turned away from him and looked into the trapdoor as I saw Sarah laying in the darkness of the trapdoor. Her clothes were soaked in sweat, and her neck was covered in bite marks like a dog attacked her. She was barely alive as her eyes were barely open and she had small jolts of movement. No, I couldn't do this. All the new power I felt was gone as I felt shock and disbelief. "Lou, put your hands behind your head now." I was taken out of my shock as I stood up and stumbled towards the lower deck. "Lou, stop!" Mr. Green shouted seconds before I felt a bullet tear through my ribs and burst out the front of my chest. I fell down the stairs and crawled across the floor of the lower deck and out the back door onto the rear deck. I used all my strength to stand on my feet and felt the sun beginning to set. I stood there using the railing to support my weight. From behind me I heard, "Lou, stop. Get on your knees and I'll help you." Mr. Green stood there in the doorway with his gun pointed at me. "You're losing a lot of blood." I looked down at the puddle of blood I was now standing in. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and charged the marshal. Just as fast as I stepped to him, I felt 2 more gunshots tear through me as I went over the railing into the water. I sunk at first, deeper and deeper into the darkness, until I saw a light above the surface. I swam towards it, fighting to get out of the water. I was just about to reach the surface before I began to feel hands pull me down, yanking on my clothes and grabbing my ankles, and as I swam, I kicked and punched the aggressors. I felt the water begin to boil, but once I broke the grip, I made it to the surface, and I climbed out of the opening of the trap door back onto the deck of the boat. I am trapped here. I don't know how I got here or what is going on, but this is hell. This boat is an infection, and it has cursed me. Every time I try to get off this dock, I end up in that boiling river of hate. All evidence left of the marshal's visit is a trail of blood across the boat and bullet holes that look to have scared a long time ago. Whatever you do, don't come look for me. Who knows how many people it's done this to already, but I won't let it happen to anyone else. I'm going to try to start a fire and let it sink into the lake. I don't know what will happen to me, but I'll be the last monster this thing creates. For your own good, stay away from Hoover Lake, stay away from Whately Bay, and for the love of God, don't step on Pier 5. Going to work is unfortunately something none of us can avoid, and after everything that I've been remembering the past few nights, I might just join the military to avoid it. My name is Clara, for the record, and I will never work in a mall ever again. Going into my store every day came with its challenges. Most of them didn't begin until the customers started to pour in from the food court. But this day was special. This day was way different. I went, opened and closed the gate as normal, and clocked in on the main computer. I glanced over and saw that my store manager left a note for me. Kind of odd, but not entirely unusual considering its fill. I had worked in that store for over a year, and he still did not understand how to schedule. I'm going out of town for the day for a company meeting. Kick butt today, and don't forget to go through and change out some of the displays, Phil. I sighed. That was his job, not mine. Another Philism for the books, I said aloud to myself. I completed the rest of my daily opening duties before I moved on to the extra stuff that Phil was pushing off onto me. I went over and grabbed the clothes pole so I could take down everything I had put up previously, reaching the pole up in the air. I tried to hook onto the hanger. Of course it wasn't easy. It was never easy. I finally caught one and wrangled it off the post like a bear catching a salmon. I sighed again, realizing that I had nothing to hang this stuff on until I put it away. Small inconveniences make for big frustrations, I said aloud to myself again. I hated going to the back room alone. I walked into the back, singing a little song to myself like a child who's afraid of the dark. This was the dark, and I am the child. I'll still admit it. I made my way to the back corner where the rolling racks were stored, and as I placed my hand on the cold metal of the bar, I realized that the lights that were normally motion sensitive hadn't turned on yet. You've got to be kidding me. I tried to pull the rack out of its cubby quicker after the gain of this knowledge. This would happen when I'm already scared. The rack stuck onto the wheels of the many other racks in the corner and refused to let go from its metallic friends. Forget it. I let go of the rack and hustled up to the motion sensor on the light. I stood there for a moment and started to flail my arms in the air rapidly to try and get it to turn on. Nothing worked, so I had no choice but to pull my phone flashlight out to solve the problem at hand. The electrical work could wait for another day. I walked back to the back corner of the room with the flashlight neatly tucked in the front of my jeans so that I had full use of my hands. As I bent down to grab a hold of the wheels in order to detangle the metal, I heard a small settling of something behind me. Not a metallic sound, but more of a piece of wet cloth dropping to the concrete ground. An alarm set off in my head. I began singing again. That was the only thing that seemed to calm me down, but I still wouldn't look behind me to see what it was. With a clang, the pieces of metal finally came undone, and the rack finally came loose. I rolled it out of the room, specifically pointing my back towards the sound. As I led the rack back out into the storefront, I looked over to the fire exit door that led to a small courtyard outside. The door had a bright red bar across the handle to let you know the alarm will sound as soon as you walk out. That was normal. The door was closed as normal, however. There was one thing that was strange. There was no light coming through the peephole of the door. I rushed back out into the front of the store, panting from not only running but also just from the quick shock that I had gotten. I checked the clock. It's 11:02 a.m. Time to open up. An hour or so went by, and there still had not been a single customer in my store. Actually, there have been like no customers besides the same groups of 2 or 3 elderly people fast walking around the mall corridors. The security guards and all the other workers are there as normal. I look out into the food court just to make sure. I stood in my entryway for a moment, being sure that I wasn't imagining things. It was indeed the same people over and over and over. £1, 2, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 16. That's it, I asked. After a few more minutes of standing behind the cash register, mulling that number 16 over in my head and glancing back into the doorway of the back room, I figured I should keep myself busy with the rest of the displays Phil told me to change. I picked the pole back up, put it into position and returned to my routine. 10 minutes went by. Still no customers, and I found myself leaning more into the music I had been playing than before, perhaps trying to keep my mind from thinking too much. 20 minutes went by, and as I was replacing the display at the top, I heard it, the exact thing that I was subconsciously afraid of. A voice, a small, faint voice. It sounded delighted in tone and seemed to only come out in a high-pitched squeal. This time, I did turn around. My whole body twisted toward the origin of the sound and, of course, nothing. Absolutely no one to be seen. I held my breath, then thought for a minute, and I exhaled again, thinking that maybe I was still wheezing from the cold I had prior. What do they call that? Grasping at straws. It took me a little bit to finally gain the courage to go back to the wall and continue the display. It was 3 p.m. by the time I finally decided to finish it. We closed at 7 p.m. I walked back over, pole in my hand, and I began putting clothes up and taking clothes down, even getting sucked into the puzzle of shelving for a little bit. Seemingly, everything weird had stopped happening, and I could finally focus on this damn display. Still, no customers. I went out to the food court again, 16. Bending down, I retrieved the last shelf from the floor and put it into place, looking underneath as I lined the pegs up with the holes in the shelf. Standing back up and taking a step back by a shirt rounder, I appreciated what I had just achieved and metaphorically and physically pat myself on the back. I walked back in front of the wall and grabbed the pole from the shelf I had leaned it up on. As I reached for the pole, I felt, on the back of my shirt, a reach for me. A small wave of a grasp that wasn't entirely successful. I gasped without thinking and spun around for a second time. Within this motion, I heard another small voice, a laugh this time, a chuckle it seemed, too human to be what I saw in that moment. Peeking through the gap in the shirts, a young girl smiled up at me. She seemed to be around 7 years old, but with extremely aging wrinkles around the sides of her eyes and deeply dark bags beneath them, dirt caking the teeth that were looming out from behind her dry, cracked lips. Sat in a stout crouch in the middle of the rounder, she held her arms out to me as if to give me a hug. The smell that permeated from her underarms as she raised them to me was a stench I could never forget. It still lingers in my nose, the smell of death, disease, and of matter, decaying with every breath she took. Tissue sloughing off her cheeks as she smiled at me. I stepped back. She smiled again, put her arms back down by her side, and ran off into the back room of my store. I called Phil. August 28th, 5:30 p.m. Phil has done nothing but laugh at me, so I'm leaving. This is the one thing I'm writing down in order to try to get everything out into the open. I'm done with the store and whatever it has to offer. I'm doing exactly what everyone in the movies doesn't do but should. He can laugh all he wants. I am not dealing with that. I'm calling security. Sergeant Stintz came to my rescue at that moment. Stintz was a small, round, and slightly uptight older man. Many people in the mall hated him because of that, but I always chalked it up to it being because he was bald. I told him about the peephole and the weird sounds. I even told him about the girl woman and how there hadn't been more than 16 people in the food court all day, him included. I asked him to go to the other side of the mall and find out more information. I didn't know what else to do. I closed the store gate at 6:30 p.m., which gave me some time to go around to other stores and see if they experienced anything strange, besides, of course, the lack of new customers. I walked up to all 3 restaurants in the food court, and they all gave me the same vacant smile, blank and soulless eye contact, and they all seemed to follow the same script. "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," with a closing, dirt-covered smile. Before turning away, dropping the smile to an almost melancholy frown and getting back to their tasks. I went to the stores next door to my own, hoping that there would be some sort of normalcy there. We had become pretty friendly due to being so close to each other. I walked into the first store, and at first I didn't see anyone at all, not a single soul. I thought maybe they had closed their store as well. Maybe they also thought some weird stuff was going on, but everything else was normal, music going, cash registers still logged into Catherine. No manager would leave their store like this. I walked around for a minute and noticed nothing else of substance and decided to go to the store on the other side of mine. I finally saw people again. I replayed in my head, please be real, whatever that meant. I had no idea. I walked up to Megan, a long-time manager of the store. She was bent over putting away displays of lamps and their boxes. I said her name, faintly but loud enough for her to hear. To no avail. I decided to tap her on the shoulder. Megan turned around as her body rotated towards me. I could see the beginning of what was a smile, muddy teeth careening from her face and lips pinned back to her ears with passionate glee. The same dark wrinkles and bags that were apparent on the girl were apparent on Megan. I jumped back. "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day." She turned back around and continued to do her task. As Megan, or this other form of Megan, continued back to her duty, a sharp screech came from what sounded like the back room of Megan's store. I will say, though, if it's anything like my back room, I wanted very little to do with it. I headed back there anyway. As I started sprinting towards the back of Megan's store, I could hear her putting all of the boxes down, and slowly footsteps began to follow me to the back. Excuse me, that area is for employees only. Please make your way to the exit. Anger grew in Megan's voice each time she repeated the phrase. I made my way to the back room. Unlike my back room, theirs had a door. Without looking back or even thinking twice, I slammed the door shut and pushed anything I could find in front of it. She didn't stop following me, although her actions didn't become hostile either, only her words grew with anger. She politely knocked on the door, and after a while, she stopped talking and just knocked on the door. I turned around, feeling secure in the room that I was trapped in. I walked into the room more, and quickly found that there was a staircase leading up to another level of the room. A scream pierced the air again, and this time I was solidified in my answer by going up there. I made it to the top of the staircase and walked down a long, slender and dimly lit hallway. One door was visible to me at the very end, a flicker of light blinking underneath the door as if to invite me in. Another scream was cast through the air. The door was completely shut when I walked up to it. I tried to slowly open the doorknob, but it let out a terrifying moan. I froze and looked around me, hoping no one would be led to my area. I peered into the room after a minute or two and saw Sarah, Megan's employee, tied up to the boiler in the corner of the room, slashes and cuts smeared across her chest. Her shirt barely hung off her shoulders due to the trauma cast upon her. She was turned away from me, her face pressed up against the wall. I whispered her name. She turned her head towards me, and as she did, there were two purple swollen sockets where her eyes should have been. Sarah, Clara, you should not be here. She shakes her head. Somehow her eyes were still able to cry. Clara, I'm here to help you. Hold still so I can get the rope off. I moved closer to her, trying to get my hands on the knot of the rope. She started to squirm. Clara, I know you're scared, Sarah. I'm sorry. I promise I'm not one of them, okay? She stopped moving. Her head slowly moved up to look at me, still making eye contact. Sarah, one of who? Clara, what do you mean? Clara, I mean one of these fucks who hurt you, okay? I'm not going to hurt you. I reached out to untie her again. She pulled from me. Sarah, how do I know that? How do I know they didn't do that to you too? Clara, Sarah, please, I'm begging you. Let me get you out of here. Sarah, don't touch me, you freak. You are one of those things that did this. You are. She started laughing now, not a humorous laugh, more of a laugh someone expels when they've truly given up. As Sarah laughed, I began to hear footsteps down the hallway and a faint, "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," echoing into the room. I scooched back, trying to push my back up against the wall as tight as I could so maybe they wouldn't see me behind the door. There was no other place to hide. They swung the door open, luckily not closing it behind them. "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," they said as they entered the room. It was two men, one that worked at the shoe store on the other side of the mall, and the other was wearing a mask. Another, "Thank you for coming. Have a nice day," was expelled from the mall employee, and an uncommon "up you go" came from the other. I let out a slight gasp when I heard this. They stood Sarah up on her feet. Her legs were barely able to hold her weight. The two men spun her around, and the masked man plunged an elbow into the middle of her back, forcing her to stand up straight. I gasped again. I watched as the masked man grabbed Sarah's face by the chin, turned her to face him and spit in her swollen face. "Masked man, that's what you get for trying to get in my way." He smacked her across the face. His spit flew off of her lips as he hit her, and that's for just being a bitch. "Mark, thank you for coming. Have a nice day." The mall employee, Mark, I think his name was, followed suit with spit to Sarah's face, followed by a deep smack. The smile never left his wrinkled and deformed face. "Masked man, I found your stash, sweetheart. I don't know how you thought you could do this to me. To me, really. I mean, it's kind of biological if you think about it. Even without seeing me, you can tell that men are inherently stronger than women. It's just science, babe." He shrugged and pulled out a large butcher's knife from the waist of his pants. "I kind of feel like a real-life villain right now. Ha ha! This is one of a kind, truly. Thank you for making this possible." He grabbed Sarah's face again and made her turn towards him, this time kissing her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too tight along her jawline. "Masked man, see? I told you, I'm just stronger." With the last word leaving his lips, he plunged the knife into the top of Sarah's kneecap and sliced clockwise, nearly exposing bone. "If you really think you're strong, prove it to me." Another laugh expelled from his chest as he completed the circle around Sarah's knee, now showing bone. I began to feel sick. My stomach turned and twisted like I was the one being cut. I felt the pain in my legs and even in my chest. It was nothing I had ever felt before. The masked man finished the job on the other leg, but that's what I gathered from Sarah's cries of horror. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Masked man. Now, sweet, sweet Sarah, what is one thing you need from me before I leave you be? Sarah, who are you? And why can you talk to me when the others can't? She asked through her sobs in pain. I still couldn't look at her. Masked man. He laughs. Oh, my dear child, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. Ha ha ha. I saw his mask be cast aside in front of the door. There was a brief pause. Oh, ha ha. I guess that didn't help you, huh? He bursted out into laughter, just barely cut off by Sarah. Sarah. I said, who the fuck are you? Her screams were louder now, as if she had tried to move towards him. Masked man. Well, if you insist. He shrugged. He raised the knife and slammed it down through the floorboard, assumingly pinning Sarah to it. I heard the crash of the wood and the bellowing cries of Sarah as he laughed again. I'm surprised you can't tell by the sound of my voice, I mean, with how long we worked together. It stints, you fucking dunce. Night-night, sweet Sarah. I started to peek back around the door when I heard another slam of something into the floorboards. Sarah's once full and wholehearted screams were now nothing more than weak whimpers. Footsteps led out. Sarah went silent, as did the room. I still didn't want to believe what I just heard. Stints? So, was he looking for me now too? Sarah, poor fucking Sarah. Damn it, I could have stopped him. I could have done anything. Although I wasn't quite sure if she was worth giving my life for. What am I saying? This is sick. I left the room and made my way back down the stairs and into the original back room. I see that this store also had a fire exit door in the back. I let myself out. Unlike our store, this back door led to a small corridor that connected the different major parts of the building, not outside. Why couldn't it have led outside? The lights were incredibly dim, a pale yellow. The walls were a grimy eggshell color, and the floors were concrete. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through, unsure as to where this corridor would lead me. I saw a large double metal door at the end of the hall. The crack between the door, dark, however, no light could be seen. As I made my way towards the double doors, I began to smell a sweet but sour smell coming from the door left of the double doors. It should have been what led to one of the few restaurants within the food court. It said so on the door. I turned, suddenly losing my objective out of pure curiosity, the same thing that killed the cat. I grabbed the handle to the door, took a deep breath and pulled. The smell wafted towards me as I opened the door. It was truly petrifying. As the smell of what could only be described as rotten flesh hit me in the face, two restaurant workers were laid out still in front of me. A dirty smile creeped across their faces as my eyes glanced over them, dissipating as I closed a door. I turned away, not truly capturing what happened, and made my way towards the double doors once more, the smell of rot still in my nose. With everything that had happened so far, I had no idea how to even process what was happening at this point. I pushed through the second set of doors, instinctively putting on the ear-to-ear grin, wiping it off, then putting it back on. What was I doing? This was probably how everyone in there became one of those things. I know this now, and can even justify it as trying to blend in. There was no one there. I looked both ways and noticed, still, no one there. I saw the exit, the one thing that I could actually focus on. I checked left and right one more time, no one, and made a break for it. I reached the doors. Stints, where do you think you're headed, lady? I listened, but didn't let him influence my decision. I was getting out of there. I grabbed the door handle and got into the passageway before actually stepping outside. I went to grab the other door handle. Stints, I asked you, where are you going? He grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and raised me into the air. He turned to make me face him and spit in my face, much like he did Sarah. He was going to kill me. He took me back inside the mall, this time locking the exit doors, and threw me over the counter of a food court restaurant, landing me upon the two previously executed workers. I searched around me for anything that I could possibly find to stop him. I thought about what he had said to Sarah and how I couldn't be the one to prove him right. I tried to stumble to my feet as I felt a gaze on the back of my head. I managed to get to my knees before looking up, and met the eye line of not just Mark and Stints, but the girl woman, Megan, and the 4 other food court employees I had seen prior in the day, all peeked at me from over the counter, their wrinkled and decrepit fingers snuck over the edge of the table, their fingernails chipped and shattered away as they gripped the wood. Stints came from around the counter, through the side doors, and knelt beside me. Stints, do you understand what's going on here yet? He tapped the same knife he used to kill Sarah on the tile next to me. We here want to run a smooth and tight-knit community of hard-working employees, Miss Clara, and you, Sarah, and a few others. As you can see, he took the knife and poked at the bodies below me as if it were a dead animal. Don't really fit the bill. They, however, are perfect for the gig. He gestured behind him to the gaggle of degenerates that were caressing the counter. You do have to understand that we must let go of you now, right? No hard feelings. He chuckled and looked at me deep in my eyes. I should have gotten up and ran right then, but it was almost like he had me in a trance of some sort. After what felt like hours, I finally gained the courage to stand and run. I dashed past Stints through the side doors of the restaurant, feeling a sharp pain on my scalp as I got slightly past him. I was face to face with him again, with a fistful of my hair being the only thing giving him power over me. Before I knew it, I began to cry. I didn't want to show him my weakness, nor did I want him to have any more power over me than he already did, but it couldn't be stopped. Stints, there, sweet Clara. No need to cry. It is just a job after all. No need to fret. He wiped a tear from my face and lifted my chin to look at him. Smile for me, will you? He said, soft and arguably sincere. I did. Thank you, he said. I closed my eyes as I smiled at him, feeling the tears start to dissipate. An electric ache shot through the side of my face as I sat with my eyes closed. I couldn't place exactly where the pain was coming from, but I knew then that that wouldn't be the end of the pain. Another twinge of pain shot up from my hands, left then right. I was dropped to the ground again, a cacophony of "thank you for coming, have a nice day" erupted as I grasped at the cold tile beneath me, feeling blood rush from my palms. It all went black. I woke up, felt my legs being grasped and dragged as my head bounced off the concrete ground. I looked around to see myself within the back rooms of the mall. I looked up to see who was in control of me, and I couldn't make out who it was in front of me. Maybe due to my eyesight still being blurry from the pain, or due to the multitude of concussions I'd gained through my journey on the ground. "Hello?" I managed to say. Without looking at me, the voice replied, shaky yet strong. "Are you okay, Clara? I don't know what the fuck is happening here, but I'm really glad I decided to come in." It was Phil. "I appreciate your help, but I can walk," I said, feeling his hands let go of my ankles. "Shit, sorry, I didn't know how else to do that." As I stood to my feet, Phil grabbed my hand and dragged me out the emergency exit. It led to the same courtyard our exit led into. Phil still didn't let go. Instead, he dragged me to his car, parked in the farthest corner from the mall, and shoved me in through the passenger side door. "We're going to the hospital," he said. It all went black again. I woke up again, this time in a hospital room. I heard the beeps and buzzes from around me and saw the wires attached to every limb. No one here but Phil. "What did you tell them?" I asked, afraid of him telling them the truth, but just as terrified of him not saying anything at all. "A car accident," he replied. "I told them I found you on the side of the road on my way home from work, and here we are." I sighed, as did he. My dinner came. I've been awake now for about 3 days, and I can't get the sight of my palms or the pain I felt out of my head. The smiles and sounds I had been tormented with the whole time will now be infecting my every move forever. I hate thinking about the fact that they're there while I'm writing this today. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.